Okay, I think we can start. Thank you everyone for attending today. We have a hopefully very interesting hour ahead. My name is Xiomara. I'm a senior analysis advisor with ACAPS, and I will be facilitating the discussion today. Before we start, I would just like to ask if everybody can make sure that their microphone is muted, and to note that we will be saving questions for the end. However, do put your questions in the chat as they arise, and we will try to either respond in the chat or to incorporate them in the question and answer session at the end. For those of you who would like a live translation, we have a live translation in Ukrainian that is available. You should be able to access this at the bottom of your screen. I won't get into the specifics because it changes depending on the kind of computer that you're using. But if you need translation and it is and you cannot find where it is, please drop a question in the chat and we will help you with that. So for today, we have a presentation by ACAPS analyst Justyna Zalanska on the recently published report on exploring vulnerabilities in Ukraine through a protection lens. And this will be followed by a short discussion with 4 experts who will be speaking to us about some of the questions that arose during the analysis. So the 4 experts that we're very lucky to have on this webinar today are Tetiana Luzan, the Ukraine National Protection Cluster co-coordinator from the NGO Right to Protection, and Tetiana is an expert in law. We also have Galyna Sukhomud, a research associate at the Technical University Berlin and a member of the NGO New Housing Policy Ukraine. We have Alla Bronishevska, the head of the Protection, Gender and Inclusion Division of the Ukrainian Red Cross Society. And we have Alexandra Marakovska, the protection manager of HEX-EPR and the co-chair of the case management task team. So if everyone is good, there's no technical problems. If there are any technical problems, please drop them in the chat. We'll try to address them as we move ahead. But over to you, Justyna.
Thank you, Xiomara, for this introduction. So starting from the slide about ACAPS, for those of you who don't know us, as ACAPS, we have been present in Ukraine since March 2022, and we provide independent analysis on the humanitarian situation in the country and the wider region. But I won't cover it very extensively. What we do, you can check by yourself, and I encourage you to see our website. With regards to the report, next slide, please, Anastasia. That is related to vulnerabilities exacerbated or emerged due to the protection risk, which we recently published. It was published last week, and you can easily find this report by scanning the QR code from the slide. The aim of our report was to firstly explore the impact of some selected protection threats on specific population groups, and then to try to identify some vulnerabilities among these groups. Of course, vulnerabilities to the protection risks in Ukraine. Regarding the scope of the report, we focused on time since February 2022, and we tried to cover all regions of Ukraine. Next slide, please. The methodology of this report was based on 3 different methods, basically secondary data review, then content analysis of some legal documents, and also as a complementary, we conducted 5 key informant interviews with representatives of NGOs and key governmental institutions. The report is not free from limitations. They are related to some risks that could be underreported, and lack of disaggregated data allowing to track intersectionalities, namely when 2 different factors of vulnerability are combined, 2 or more factors of vulnerability are combined. Next slide, please, Anastasia. And with regard to the methodology and selection of the risks, So the first step for the identification of the protection risks in Ukraine was to look at the ACAPS protection incidents dataset that we have, and we've been producing it since February 2022 for Ukraine. And we wanted to see like what risks are in Ukraine and what risks are present in all regions of Ukraine. And we identified some of them. Maybe I won't mention them now, but I will go to the next slide because this was the first step of this selection process. Then we validated this selection through the SDR, secondary desk research, and through the interviews with the key informants. And in this way, we came up with 9 risks that we selected to further analysis. And these are the following: attacks on civilians, destruction of houses, torture or cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, abductions and kidnappings, then presence of mines, gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence, forced displacement, unlawful impediments or restriction to freedom of movement, including human smuggling, and impediments or restrictions to accessing legal identity documentation. Next slide, please, Anastasia. And like this step, selection of risk, was the first step of this analysis. And then we look into each specific risk and identified affected population groups in this risk and vulnerabilities among these population groups. And I will present the findings by each group now, but due to the time limit, I will focus only on the most striking issues that we came across during the analysis. And in the same time, I would like to encourage you to read the full report when you can find all the information, the statistics and the sources about the issues that I will cover today. So let's start from the older people. As they account for 1/3 of the population, they comprised more than 40% of civilian casualties of the attacks near the front line. So we can see this disproportion in the effect of the attacks and in effect of this risk, attacks on civilians. Of course, they face some challenges in evacuations. They face a lot of challenges that are related to their access to facilities, to services, and some facilities. And also we try to highlight the difficult financial situation due to low pension they have. The next group we identified are the children. And in children, what is the most striking, or at least for us, this is the constrained access to education that is a result of the attacks on civilians and the disruption to some electricity and electricity access, internet access, and so on. And this was compounded by some difficulties, some financial difficulties. For example, some families could not afford electronic devices to connect to the internet and continue the education for the children. And then another striking issue is that something that everyone knows about the abduction of children to Russia, and also apart from the abduction, there are also a lot of children who were forcibly transferred or forcibly displaced to Russia, mainly from the occupied territories. And the next group we identified are women. And women, of course, are affected by all the risk, or have been affected by all the risk included into the analysis, but they were the most vulnerable to GBV as a group. And their vulnerability to GBV, gender-based violence, is aggravated by other intersectional factors, like you can see the list here: displacement status, geographic location, age, disability, pregnancy, being a single mother, belonging to any minority, but especially to Roma ethnicity group, and gender identity or sexuality, like being a member of LGBTQ+ community. The next group we had a look at are men. Is next slide, Anastasia. And here we I think that we came across a lot of interesting issues faced by this group, and we also encountered some vulnerabilities that were somehow overlooked by previous or existing reporting. And the men, it has to be said that they account for the largest number of civilian fatalities during the attacks, and they are highly affected by the mobilization efforts that result in some movement restrictions, self-imposed isolation, and in some cases also human smuggling. And this human smuggling is particularly an issue in western macro region of Ukraine. Then men of conscription age have some difficulties or sometimes are unable to renew or request the civil documents if they are not registered at the conscription office. And they also face some heightened risk of conflict-related sexual violence, as the report show. Then the next group we identified are people with disabilities, and the most striking thing for us was that there was a very high increase in the number of people with disabilities starting from February 2022. The data show that 30,000 new people have acquired kind of like any type of disability, and we couldn't find a data confirming this, like how many people acquired disability status through the whole period, but we know the data just for the first year after the full-scale invasion, and these were 130,000 people who acquired disability status. So knowing that in Ukraine there is close to 3 million people with disabilities, this is the 10% when we speak about 30,000 people. So 10% more people with disabilities just for 2.5 years. So this is really a huge number. And of course, among this group, some people also have, and this is also a big group, have lost their limbs because of the attacks on civilians and other virus incidents. And also this group face a lot of barriers in accessing either emergency information or some services like shelters, safe havens. They also are at risk at sexual, economic, and psychological violence. And those who live in the front lines face higher risk comparing to those people with disabilities who live in other areas. So they face higher physical risk like physical assault, robbery. And it was also something that we try to highlight in the report, that there is a phenomenon of institutionalization in Ukraine regarding this group, and especially regarding older people with disabilities. So people who could live independently before the war, or before they had to be brought to the institution, now do not have this chance because there is like no do not have a proper and adjusted housing and a proper and adjusted care for them, so they can live independently, and they had to be taken to the institutions. So this is something worrisome. And the last, no, it's not the last, it's almost the last. The next group is that we identified as affected population group is LGBTQ plus people who continue to experience violence, although the reported cases, number of the reported cases decreased in 2023 compared to 2022. But it's not that we are, we don't know like to what extent we can trust the reportings, because especially with regard to the GBV and with regard to some sexual violence, the reporting can be really misleading. But some like articles, reports, also humanitarian reports show that there is kind of improvement in perception of LGBTQ plus people in the wider Ukrainian society. So it is something positive, I think. And then transgender men and women who face particular struggles in changing their identity documents, which could confirm their gender. And the last group that we focused on were ethnic minorities. Please change the slide. Yes, and among these, we took a look at two, Crimean Tatars in the occupied territories and Roma people. So Crimean Tatars are, of course, the ethnic minority that traditionally lived in Crimea, and they still live there, but they faced like a lot of difficulties and are targeted by occupying forces because of their traditional pro-Ukrainian stance. And with regard to Roma people, they are at risk. They are likely at risk of all risks selected to this report, but we couldn't confirm this because of lack of disaggregated data. And what we could actually confirm is that having Roma origin increases the risk of experiencing GBV by women, and this place Roma people struggle to access basic services, and they struggle to register as IDPs or enroll their children in schools because they do not have proper identity documentation. And that's all from my side, and I would like to encourage you to go to the ACAPS website or to the link shared in the chat and read the full report and see what other information you can get from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justyna. That was very interesting. And underreporting is always such an issue in protection analysis, making this kind of work really difficult. I really appreciated the presentation based on population groups. And it's always good to be reminded that, you know, gender is important to look at, not just to focus on women, but because the impacts on men and women are so different, but neither group is unaffected. For those who will go in and read the report, I think that the geographic distinctions highlighting throughout how people experience the conflict differently depending on location as well is very helpful. So just a reminder to everyone that we will be having opportunities to ask questions in the end. Do feel free to drop your questions in the chat if you have any while our panelists are engaged in the discussion. But we are going to turn over to the panelists. During our analysis, we realized that there were more questions arising than we had answers. And so we reached out to the four ladies on this call to ask some key questions, and each one will have 7 minutes to speak. And some have also prepared presentations for us, so they'll be answering the questions through a presentation. The first panelist is Tetiana. We reached out and we asked, what is the role of humanitarian actors in the evacuation of people from frontline areas? And who are the most vulnerable groups during this evacuation, and what are their main challenges? So over to you, please, Tetiana.
Thank you, Xamor. Please confirm that you do hear me and I can continue.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me here. Good afternoon, colleagues. I know that my time is quite limited. So before answering to your question, I just want to say that and to provide some background, because protection cluster activities, one of the protection cluster activities are humanitarian evacuations. And specifically to address this issue and support protection cluster partners, protection cluster published recently revised recommendations on humanitarian evacuations of civilians in Ukraine. You can see my email address on the first slide. So just in case you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out and we will be happy to answer. Next slide, please. So again, being limited in time, I will just very briefly say that the purpose of the revision of the initially published recommendation in 2022 was exactly to have one of the focuses vulnerabilities as such. So to make sure that within these 2 years, we can capture the whole picture of vulnerabilities and their effect on evacuation, or their kind of factoring in evacuation. So this was one of the reasons to have this update, but also to do it from localization lens to make sure that this is not, so to say, vision or imposing vision of protection cluster regarding vulnerabilities, but exactly to have this feedback from the humanitarian organization, protection organizations who are conducting evacuations. And very much related issue, because as it turned out, this is a complex issue and many elements should be considered. And one of the additional elements was Ukrainian legislation, because intersection in between, so to say, state-led, state-organized evacuations and humanitarian evacuations needed further exploration. So just summing up here, that the revised recommendations are available, and the main target audience was exactly humanitarian protection actors conducting evacuations. One of the components are vulnerabilities, specifically evacuation of children from the areas of forced evacuation, and also evacuation of people with disabilities. However, also other vulnerable groups exactly mentioned by Justina are also mentioned in the recommendation as well. LGBTQI representatives of LGBTQI communities, Romas, Roma population, and others, including men. Next slide, please. So now answering directly to your question, it was obvious for us that after 2 years, Ukrainian legislation evolved quite significantly. And for us, it was important to delineate first what is humanitarian evacuation, what is state-led evacuation, then to understand how humanitarian actors may be engaged in both ways or in both types. So if to discuss humanitarian evacuation per se, you can see on the screen that we have a definition, so to say. This is, it refers to situation when humanitarian protection actors facilitate the relocation of civilians from dangerous areas related to armed conflict, to other forms of violence, to locations where they are at lower risk. So specifically, this type of evacuation is the main focus of the recommendations. But then it became clear that apart from engagement or conducting purely humanitarian evacuations, there are also state-led evacuations. So it's, so to say, double process there. And it is necessary to understand how and what is the vision of Ukrainian legislation regarding evacuation is. So if to simplify, because it's not that easy, as always with Ukrainian legislation, there are mandatory evacuations and mandatory evacuation of children in a forced manner. When it comes to mandatory evacuation, or despite English word mandatory, they are basically voluntary. This is not the case with forced evacuation of children. So for us, it was important to guide humanitarian actors that they should never be engaged in involuntary evacuations or coerce anyhow or force civilians to be evacuated. However, when the evacuation, this type of evacuation, state-led evacuation, has taken place, people who were evacuated should have access to humanitarian assistance. So answering or summing up answer to your question. In Ukraine, we have purely humanitarian evacuation. And here, more or less, everything is clear. We have specific guidelines in this case that may be found in the note in the document. When it comes to state-led evacuations, it's necessary to make sure that humanitarian actors never engage in involuntary evacuations. And also, it is necessary definitely to recognize that humanitarian actors, protection actors play a great role in all kinds of evacuations happening in Ukraine. I don't want to say that there is over-reliance on humanitarian actors. However, there is a significant part that they have in the overall evacuation movement in Ukraine. Next slide, please. So now back to vulnerabilities. As I previously mentioned, for us it was important to make sure that the node reflects reality, so to say, and it's not something that is perceived from Kiev. And exactly the feedback was that vulnerabilities should be in the, or have a significant role and should be in the focus of attention when it comes to evacuations. Because what we saw, those ones who were vulnerable before the evacuation are most likely to be even more vulnerable after evacuation. This big kind of chunk, unfortunately, of problems were related to people with disabilities or low or reduced mobility, because specifically there is a legislative gap in coordination of process of evacuation of people with disabilities, including from institution. There is information gap because of legislative gap, no exact number in terms of people who are in need of evacuation and vacant places. And then lack of staff in the receiving oblast or hromadas. So even if people with disabilities or reduced low mobility are evacuated, then it's difficult to provide necessary services to these people. When it comes to children, it is still a bit of a problem, evacuation of people from institutions, to make sure that it is done in a coordinated manner. Next slide, please. I don't want to kind of spend a lot of time on this slide, because you can, I will send a link to this, and I can see that 1 more minute left, and I will send you the link to the updated guidance, so feel free to reach out. I will just say that these or our observations after communication and consultations with Ukrainian NGOs engaged in evacuations are very much in line with ACAPS report, because specifically for us it's important to make sure that those ones who are vulnerable do have access to information related to evacuation in an easy to understand format, and this is something that Protection Cluster is working now on. And also that there is a collaborative process with women's rights organization, organizations of people with disabilities, to make sure that these people are identified, those the most vulnerable, and that they then are referred after the evacuation to necessary services. All specific needs are assessed and included in the process of evacuation. And the last slide for now, next please. Overall tendencies and questions related to funding. Because what we see in terms of vulnerability, those who are still remaining at frontline are people with disabilities and older people, and we are trying to exactly target this group of people by information dissemination to make sure that they can make an informed decision regarding evacuation. The problem with evacuation is basically its fluctuant character, because it's very much dependent on the intensification of hostilities. As you can see, numbers, this is something what was recent evacuations in Kharkivska Oblast and Donetsk. And there is still intensification, and we can predict that the number will be higher, but again, the exact numbers, it's difficult to predict. Then we should consider for tendencies winter period, because we can make a conclusion that it's possible that there will be another wave of evacuation or displacement. Finally, I want just to say that overall, in terms of funding, there is a depletion of resources from humanitarian side, but also from state side. This is something that we should keep in mind, and simultaneously shrinking humanitarian money generally for Ukraine, but also and specifically for Western and Central Ukraine. However, these regions are the receiving regions, and for us it's important to make sure, because of the nature of evacuation, it's not only take people out of some region, but also to make sure that they have access to services, accommodation, etc. after evacuation. And the last thing that the protection cluster is promoting, based on the feedback and requests from civil society organizations and volunteers, that any kind of funding related to evacuation are flexible, multi-year funding, and also focused on institutional capacity building. I will stop here, not taking more time. In case you have any questions, please ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tetiana. Very interesting, and I'm sure these revised recommendations are going to be very, very useful to humanitarian actors. And it's good to know that in vulnerability analysis, we are picking up on the same groups. For any questions, please do drop them in the chat. And now we would like to hand over to Galyna, who also prepared a presentation to answer our questions around the housing situation for IDPs and the types of accommodation and the risks and the challenges that they face. So over to you, Tetiana.
Yeah, next slide, please.
Sorry, over to you, Galyna. My gosh.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to join this very productive discussion. I feel the housing discussion is interrelated to many topics present here, especially with vulnerabilities, because on the one hand, the lack of accessible and affordable housing, it's accumulate different vulnerabilities. So it increases the instances of gender-related violence, so complicates the access of children to education or a reinstitutionalization of elderly people. But at the same time, because of the group of displaced has such a high vulnerability, so complex vulnerabilities, it's not possible to solve housing crisis in Ukraine through so-called like market solutions or not intervention solutions, which happening now. And of course, it's very related to topic of evacuations and where people could go after they have evacuated from front-line regions. So basically in Ukraine, there is no comprehensive system of accommodations existing for IDPs. So it's like patchwork system of different ad hoc solutions, which relies a lot on civil society, solidarity networks, which includes also support of family and friends and different international organizations. Collective accommodations run also in combinations by NGO, privately, international organizations, and accommodations provided for employees and rental market. And rental market, it's like major player currently in Ukraine, because according to IOM, 60% of all IDPs, they reside in rental accommodations in Ukraine. Next slide. So with just some overview of existing collective sites, so there are quite a lot of them, but if we see total numbers of displacements, so currently collective accommodations have capacities of around 100,000 people, and there is more than 3 million of displaced, so it's not playing or like given possibility for everyone to stay there. And above all, there is a lack of moving out, or the majority of people, they stay there more than a year or plan to stay there further. So there is a big hindrances to move out, because basically there is very little options where to go. Next slide. So I wanted to put attention to rental market because rental market plays a major role in accommodation of IDPs in Ukraine. But since full-scale invasions, prices and rental market continue to grow with the growing demand and a lot of speculative increase in rental prices. So next slide. And it just to overview that in some Western Ukrainian cities, the median price for one-bedroom apartment already is almost the same as median household income. So the rental accommodations, particularly in Western or perceived safer regions of Ukraine, it's hardly affordable for average Ukrainians. So next slide. And so if we see housing cost over burden of IDPs households, it's up to 100%. It's in the study which I did with my colleague last summer. So we would meet people who would say that they will earn 10,000 hryvnias and then they would need to pay 10,500 hryvnias and they would live basically from humanitarian aid for food. And it's not only like one case, so just bad selections of respondents, because according to recent IOM housing brief recently published in July 2024, 38% of all IDPs spent more than 70% of their household income on housing, and while 60% spent more than half of their household income on housing. So it's like in comparison in Germany or in EU, if you have a housing cost over burden more than 30%, it's considered a lot. And maybe next slide. Oops. And next. Yeah, and it just to mention that it's not only about price, but a lot of discrimination based, and this discrimination often based on vulnerability, like people having disability or people having children, or even IDP status itself can serve as a discrimination basis in accessing rental market accommodation. So the next slide. And it just to see that, and that in Europe security is very low, so a lot of people would not have documents related to their current rental situation. And next slide. And otherwise, even if they have in our studies, so if even they have a rental agreement, it does not mean anything because they still, due to lack of institutional landscape to facilitate tenant protection or lack of tenant protection per se in Ukrainian law, there would be still high levels of displacement despite existing rental agreements. Next slide. And it just to see why it's important, especially to understand in the context of humanitarian aid, so this high prices and inaccessibility of rental market, it leads to immobility of IDPs. So even those IDPs who live or being evacuated from their homes, they still somehow they stay in the rather eastern regions, of course, due to connections or the desire to support their family, but often just because Western and safer regions are out of reach and remain unaffordable for them. And next slide. And it just some other other reasons also why this rental market accessibility is important in humanitarian context, that one of the coping solutions, coping mechanism of dealing with this housing crisis would be also staying in place in half ruined houses, so continue living there. And in Ukraine, it's very high population of people, an estimated 3 million people, Ukrainians, continue to live in damaged buildings. And just the last one, or like the next slide and will be the last one. And or other coping mechanism would be just living abroad, especially like women living abroad to support their families in Ukraine by working somewhere to pay rent. So basically, lack of affordable housing, it exacerbates all existing vulnerabilities and also forces to this continuous displacement or keeps people from evacuating from unsafe regions. Thank you so much. And if you have questions, please write them in the chat because I need to leave a bit earlier, so you are very welcome.
Thank you so much, Galyna. The cost of housing compared to income is really quite shocking. And of course, all the many knock-on effects beyond shelter insecurity that come with lack of access to affordable housing. I won't lie, the housing discrimination against children surprised me, but perhaps it shouldn't have. Our next two speakers will be discussing GBV, but from different perspectives. So we will be listening to Alla and Alexandra. So for Alla, over to you, I believe, because you'll be talking about how the situation regarding GBV has changed over the last 2.5 years and who is most affected and vulnerable and why. So over to you, Alla.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. My name is Alla Bronishevska, and thank you very much for having me here. And thank you, previous speakers, for impressive and shocked figures and data. Actually, I can only say that it's very important to understand and to know how we need to proceed and how we need to assist in our future transaction and future activities in humanitarian field. Also, I would like to help exactly ACAPS for the report. It's very impressive and important to understand what really happened with protection risk and exploring vulnerabilities through the lens of protection risk. And my topic today, please be so kind, and next slide. And my topic today will be briefly discuss about gender-based violence. And if you look at the slide, you will see the figures that according to previous estimation and assessment, about 2.5 million people for nowadays, it's vulnerable IDP, returnees, and non-displaced people are at the high risk of gender-based violence and the need for immediate and continuous life-saving GBV prevention, risk mitigation, response action across all of Ukraine. On next slide, please. I just would like to highlight the list of vulnerable people who are on the main risk of violence. And if you look at the list, you will see that actually for nowadays, it's women and girls residing in the close proximity to the frontline areas in the north, south, and east of Ukraine. It's also IDP, women and girls who lives in collective sites, particularly located in remote, hard-to-reach areas or those to move passing transit centers. Also, it's a women and girls with disabilities or living with HIV who struggling to access the services and support regarding the disabilities. It's also the women and girls, boys and men trapped in areas under the temporary military control of Russian Federation. It's a woman supporting the Ukrainian response as a soldiers or armed actors. It's a woman and man prisoner of war, particularly those detained by Russian military. It's Roma people who has historically discrimination and continue to do it and more suffer during the wartime in Ukraine. And also it's a people of different sexual orientation and gender identities who experience discrimination and harassment before, and for nowadays is discrimination and harassment is getting more higher. The next slide, please. In this slide, we just look the types of gender-based violence, the most common for nowadays, unfortunately, in Ukraine. First of all, it's conflict-related sexual violence that we'll briefly discuss a little late. It's sexual exploitation and abuse, human trafficking, risk of intimate partner violence, including domestic violence, and sexual harassment and other forms of GBV. The next slide, please. Briefly regarding conflict-related sexual violence. We know that it's priority of investigation of Prosecutor Office, General Prosecutor Office of Ukraine and Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. And all such cases that it's possible to be documented It just shows us what kind of vulnerable people suffer from this kind of violations. And according to data, it's aging from 3 to 7 years old people. And it's also women, men, girls, and boys, including persons with different sexual orientation and gender identities. In majority cases of incidents involving adults, male survivor, sexual violence was documented as a method of torture, that includes different kind of torture. Women and girls remaining in the frontline areas are the most suffer from this kind of violence, conflict-related sexual violence, especially because they are not protected. And it's the north, south, and east parts of Ukraine. It's the most closer frontline area to the conflict. And all these vulnerable people face with consequences of drastically deterioration, security situation, and limited or absolutely no possibility to access to the livelihoods, psychological trauma caused by war, and lack of access of life-saving services on intervention, including GBV services, etc. Because particularly part of the services are not possible to receive in this area of Ukraine. The next slide, please. I briefly would like to show you the main problem that happen with vulnerable people, people who suffer from gender-based violence in transit center and placed in collective center. We briefly already discussed, and Galyna showed us some information regarding situation in these places, but briefly I would like to state that unfortunately the lack of privacy and single sex accommodation in collective sites and non-secure wash facilities, limited or no access to life-saving information services and livelihood opportunities, lack of financial resources, increased risk of exploitation, a lack of electricity, especially in this part of houses, individual alcohol and drug abuse, all these factors significantly influence on the girls and women who live there, and the impact of displacement and economic vulnerability exacerbates the risk of adoption of negative mechanisms, including sexual exploitation and sexual abuse in this place of IDP living. The next slide, please. Just according to the last data of protection cluster, only for few months of 2024, the amount or the cases that only registered of intimate partner violence and domestic violence increased in about 20% only in 2024. It shows us that unfortunately, even in families, the situation is not stable, especially in families with returning war veterans, with combatants who return to their family only for some vacation time or just return from the war. And data from Kharkivska, Khersonska, Mykolaievska, Sumska, and Zaporizhzhia region shows the doubling of intimate partners violence. It's more than 20%. And other manifestation of domestic violence cases that significantly increased in this territory. Also, assessment show us additional stigma and fear of information that could be disseminated regarding domestic violence or intimate partner violence, just to stop vulnerable people or survivor to apply to police or to another state organization to be provided with some support and assistance. According to the data and assessments that have been done in the Paperovska and Zaporizhzhia Oblast, about 70% of respondents advise that they would not report of case of GBV, including case of intimate partners violence and domestic violence, because they afraid of stigma and fear of some retaliation by perpetrators. As I remember, it's my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. And if any question regarding GBV and protection and regulation of this issue, you can ask by the end of all our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alla, and thank you for also highlighting that, at the end, that people are not reporting GBV, and that using prevalence data or reporting data makes it very, very difficult to do effective GBV analysis.
Yeah.
We are over to our last speaker, Alexandra, who I believe will be talking about both regional differences in GBV and available services to GBV survivors in Ukraine. So over to you, please, Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues, for really interesting data. It was so pleasant to listen to it and just reflect on it. Thank you. So I remember about my 7 minutes, so I'll try to be brief. So as for regional differences in GBV prevalence, I would specify 6 of them. The first one is conflict zones versus non-conflict areas. Just to understand that places with frequent attacks such as Kyiv City, Odessa, Kharkivska, Donetsk, Mykolaiv oblasts may experience high GBV rates due to the increased chaos, displacement, and disruption of social services. The heightened risk of sexual violence and exploitation can be a consequence of ongoing military activities and the breakdown of law and order. The second one is urban versus rural areas. In rural areas, you may report higher levels of GBV due to isolation, lack of access to services, and traditional attitudes that perpetrate violence. Women and girls in these areas might have less access to support services and legal recourse. Also, we have to talk about occupied territories versus government control areas. In regions occupied by Russian forces or where there is a high degree of instability, GBV risks can increase due to lack of law enforcement and oversight. In Ukraine, areas that are controlled by Russian forces or closer to conflict zones are often reported to have higher incidence of GBV, although it doesn't mean that if the number of reported cases is low, it doesn't mean that the number of cases is the same. Just people, as we heard from the previous panelists, people are afraid to and they do not report because of different reasons. Also, areas with significant displacement could increase GBV due to overcrowded conditions, lack of support services, and heightened vulnerabilities. Impact of poverty and unemployment can correlate with higher levels of GBV. Unfortunately, economic stress can make tensions higher within households, leading to increased violence. And of course, economic hardships in certain regions may contribute to higher GBV rates as family struggles with financial stress and lack of resources. And the last but not the least is cultural and social norms, as it was previously discussed, that traditional norms and stigma that areas with strong traditional gender norms and stigma around reporting GBV may have higher prevalence rates. Cultural acceptance of certain forms of violence can lead to underreporting or even normalization of GBV. And the reasons for these regional differences are different. It could be the conflict intensity, service availability, social or cultural factors. There are also transportation and communication barriers, different economic factors, cultural attitudes, and also legal and institutional factors. I won't be just talking in details about them. I would rather talk about the services, how the services for GBV survivors look like in Ukraine, and about their availability and how they changed since 2022. So as per services for GBV survivors in Ukraine, they typically include emergency hotlines. They work 24/7, offer an immediate support, counseling, and guidance, as well as medical care. There are emergency and ongoing medical treatment, including care for physical and psychological trauma, as well as legal assistance. There is support for navigating the legal system, including representation and advice for survivors seeking justice. There are shelters and safe spaces, which are temporary housing and safe environments for survivors fleeing abusive situations. There is counseling and psychosocial support, and also economical support, and as well as case management or social support from both humanitarian actors and social services, state social services. And what we have to think about is the availability of these services, that if we talk about urban and rural areas, of course, in urban areas, these services are very, they are everywhere and there are different actors, but in contrast, rural and conflict-affected areas often face significant gaps in availability due to logistical challenges, fewer resources, personnel, etc. And the same goes for conflict zones, because areas have been affected by conflict, such as parts of eastern Ukraine, southern, and even eastern northern parts. And the frontline regions face particular challenges in providing consistent and comprehensive services. And if I have 30 more seconds, I would like to talk about the changes in the access since 2022. So, of course, there are some improvements, and there are some improvements that we have to talk about: increased humanitarian presence, about mobile and remote services, that the awareness around the services has increased, and the coordination between different humanitarian actors has improved, although there are also still challenges around the same improvements. And the main point that I would like to underline is this difference between urban and rural areas, because this is where the most vulnerabilities, most of challenges are. That in rural areas we still have a lot of need and a lot of work to provide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and everyone, honestly, for attending and for speaking. I just wanted to ask if there are any questions. We are a little bit behind, but if there are any questions, please do raise your hands or drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we will wrap things up. Just a reminder, if you found this interesting, the report, the webinar, please do reach out to us directly or sign up for our newsletter. If you have any questions that you would like to ask later, I think our various panelists have also dropped their emails in the chat, so you can also reach them directly. Yes, once you leave the webinar, there will be a survey that pops up. If you could just take 1 minute to fill that in, that would be very, very helpful for us to assess and understand how useful our work is to the humanitarian response as a whole. Thank you. And thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Justina, I do have a question. Could you share the presentations with us as well? Like, is it possible? Because they were very, very interesting. You are muted.
Sorry for this. I will share the presentations and I will share the recording as well. With maybe not only with the speakers, but also with like all the people who were present.
This is great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing it. It was really, really interesting.
And then next time we'll try to have some longer discussion around these topics, because all these are pressing things and we can see that there's a lot to talk about. So it would be really great to have a space and, you know, go more deeply into some subjects.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone, and thank you very much for invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Alla, for your participation. It was very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.